thank you all for coming. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces and some unfamiliar ones too. As Michael has already said, I've been at the university now for 10 years. First 3 of those was doing my PhD, and then that's where I looked at implementation for the first time of the social and emotional aspects of learning intervention in secondary schools. Since then, I've continued my research in that area, worked on multiple evaluations within the department with Michael and other team members as well, and Alex. And I've led the implementation strand within those projects. I also lecture on the Masters in Psychology of Education, and my background is in psychology, so I approach implementation really from that sort of perspective. So just for a quick overview, essentially we're going to look at implementation and then try and apply what we know from the literature to the effective delivery and evaluation of school-based interventions. So we'll look first at what implementation science is, we'll build in why it matters right the way through the session, and then we'll think about applying this knowledge. If we can leave questions till the end, that'd be really helpful, because I've perhaps been a little bit ambitious and decided to do more than I can comfortably cover in this short time. And also it may be that any questions that you have, I do cover in subsequent slides. So we're going to start off with what implementation is. It's essentially the set of activities that compose the process of putting a practice or program into place in an organisation. This practice or programme can take a very broad range. It could be a highly structured, manualised intervention, or it may be a very simple, informal, individual approach, such as teacher-led work on deserved praise. So implementation is putting all these activities into practice, and implementation science is then the study of these processes. Implementation science, it's a new and evolving area. It probably originated in the 1960s with the publication of Rogers' 1963 work on diffusion of innovations. Up until that time, rather amazingly it seems to me now, there was this assumption that you could give an intervention to a teacher, to any other individual, to an organisation. It could be an evidence-based intervention, and they would automatically achieve all these outcomes that were expected. Then it gradually dawned on people that, as Rogers said, they weren't passive acceptors of an intervention or a new policy or approach. Rather, implementers became active modifiers. So any intervention, any approach then became adapted. And that really, really matters, because the research literature is showing us that implementation variability has a direct impact on the achievement of anticipated outcomes. So first hint that implementation science is actually really rather important. 3 key interrelated goals to implementation science, which are understanding implementation processes, supporting them, and evaluating them. I think it's useful to conceptualize these as a cycle, because each feeds into the other. We need to understand implementation to be able to support it, but that will then feed back into our understanding and what we need to evaluate when we're looking at interventions. So understanding implementation processes in a nutshell is looking at what is happening in practice in any given context, trying to understand why is implementation variable, why are interventions not delivered exactly as designed. If you're evaluating it, you're looking at variability. Why does this impact on effectiveness? You're using implementation data to explain outcomes. At an earlier stage of intervention development, it can be used to assess feasibility, to modify programs so that they are more acceptable, and to identify critical components. Supporting is using knowledge generated through these to optimize implementation and maximize the effectiveness of an intervention in multiple different contexts. We're going to speak about each or I'm going to speak about each, you can if you want to join in a little bit more depth, and I'm going to start with understanding implementation processes. So the first thing to understand is that there are multiple dimensions to implementation. Implementation science takes in literature from across a broad spectrum of disciplines, from psychology, education, various social sciences, business, medicine. So these are generally agreed upon dimensions of implementation. There's fidelity, program reach, program differentiation, dosage quality, adaptations, and participant responsiveness. There is also another dimension which is pretty important, monitoring comparison conditions, but that matters for evaluations rather than implementation more generally, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So going on to these different dimensions, the first one to look at is fidelity or adherence, and this can be defined as the degree to which implementers, teachers, implement programs as intended by the program developers. So it's the extent to which an intervention or approach is delivered exactly as designed. That's a nice simple definition, but it gets a little bit confusing because there are two ways of defining fidelity within the literature, and we need to be aware of that in order to understand research output. So the macro view will see fidelity as a superordinate construct which comprises dosage, quality, all the other different dimensions. The micro view sees implementation as a superordinate construct and fidelity rated alongside the other dimensions. Now this matters because if you're reading research literature, you will find papers that say yes, fidelity is directly linked to outcomes. If they are using a macro view, you don't know whether it's the fidelity purely, whether it's the quality, which aspect of implementation it is. So it's very important to be able to make that distinction. We generally use the micro view because it supports greater understanding of the effects of the different dimensions of implementation. So fidelity, we would define it as the extent to which an implementer will be faithful to the structure of an intervention, sequence of activities, which are prescribed or advised by an intervention developer. In a very heavily prescribed or manualised intervention, you could have strict lesson plans or implementation steps. With a more informal approach, it might be a series of guidance steps. But there's always this advice about how you would implement or deliver any sort of intervention or approach. There's also fidelity to process, i.e. how an intervention is delivered, but it's sometimes more useful, and we're going to do that, consider it with quality, because it's more about how it is delivered. The next one is dosage or exposure. You may notice that the terminology does relate to medicine, and that reflects the origins of some of implementation science. I do sometimes wonder whether we ought to change it so that it reflects different disciplines. However, that may lead to more confusion, so I think perhaps to some extent it's better to keep it standardised across disciplines. So dosage or exposure is the amount of an intervention that is implemented. So in a structured intervention, it could be the number of lessons or sessions, and it could also be the duration or completeness of a session or an individual approach. One thing to remember is that maximum dosage, even the dosage that may be prescribed by a program developer, is not necessarily optimal. You can get fatigue effects which would lead to decreased participant engagement, and we actually saw this in the SEAL project. We're asking pupils about, and do you do SEAL, do you like it, and what do you think about SEAL? Oh, we always go, not SEAL again. So it did actually decrease the engagement of the pupils in it. There is a distinction between dosage which is delivered and dosage which is received, and that comes under programme reach. Quality. Now this is one of my favourites, and it relates to how well the intervention components are implemented. Now if you're talking about how well, I think you almost inevitably introduce this subjectivity. How well something is done depends on the perceptions of the individual. With fidelity and with dosage, you can perhaps quantify and measure those more easily. But how well the intervention requires us to make a judgment. So looking at the literature, the emphasis seems to be on how an implementer interacts with an intervention. Are they prepared to deliver it? Are they engaged with it? Do they like it? What are their skills to deliver it? And where appropriate, do they provide opportunities for the recipients of the intervention to generalise any new skills or learning that they have acquired during the intervention? Participant responsiveness is the extent to which the recipients of an intervention are engaged by the activities and content that is delivered. Now again, I think this definition could really do with extending a little bit. Initially, in the education literature on implementation, engagement or responsiveness was measured by the number of pupil worksheets that were completed. Now, to me, that shows you or indicates how many pupils have completed a lesson, but it doesn't really indicate how engaged they actually were. And I would argue that responsiveness needs to be extended beyond this pure engagement to actually include how a recipient responds to an intervention. What do they do with any new knowledge that they've acquired? Do they go off and apply it? Do they generalise it? So participant responsiveness could, I think, do with some extension. We then move on to programme reach, which is the extent to which the intended recipients of an intervention actually experience it. Now, implementation science, some of its origins was in health interventions, community health interventions particularly, and you can understand why you would need to look at programme reach there, because participants aren't forced to attend. If you have an after-school programme, children could just go home, so you can't guarantee that they're actually going to be there, so you'd have to check the programme reach. It has been ignored to a certain extent within school-based interventions, but I think really we need to consider that too. Anybody that's involved with schools knows that pupils can be withdrawn from any lesson or from any intervention if a teacher feels that there is some other skill that they need to be developing, some other area where they're falling behind and need extra support. There is also absence as well, so you can't assume that a pupil is present for an intervention. You have to actually check it. Now, this really matters in evaluation. If, for example, you were looking at the impact of an intervention and you were looking at Year 7 pupils, you're doing your pre-test and then you're seeing what the outcomes are in certain areas, you might assume that they have actually received that intervention. Unless you check, you're not going to be able to interpret your impact findings fully, because it could be that teachers have looked at this intervention and thought, this is more suitable for Year 8, we'll give it to Year 8. You're not measuring Year 8 outcomes, you're measuring Year 7. So programme reach is important within implementation in education. Programme differentiation, this is a very interesting dimension, and it was, like monitoring comparison conditions, initially linked to evaluation of interventions. However, from studies that we've done recently, and Alex will bear this out for me as well, I think it's really something that we need to look at within the main part of implementation. What it actually means is how distinct the theory, activities and practices of the intervention are when compared to those already in use in the school. So essentially it means, what are the teachers, school or anybody doing already? How is this new intervention different? Okay, and this matters because if a school is familiar with the concepts included within intervention and you give them this new intervention to do, it can be an advantage. It's not something new to learn. However, their familiarity with this existing approach may mean that they don't fully adopt a new intervention, and it may mean that they swap their existing practice and put this into place in the new intervention. It can work the other way around as well. If a school is not familiar with this sort of intervention, we need to know that they're not familiar with it, because then that can be a barrier to adoption, to implementation, because it's something new for teachers to learn. This can lead to more stress, all sorts of reasons why teachers don't always want to adopt a new intervention. So I think that programme differentiation has to be considered within a broader area of implementation rather than just within an evaluation, because if you're supporting implementation, you need to check how different the programme actually is. Then any adaptations. This is my overall favourite of all dimensions of implementation, which probably sounds a bit sad, doesn't it? I'm really sorry about that, but it's not supposed to. I think it's so exciting. Adaptations refer to any addition, subtraction or modification to the original programme model or expected quality of delivery. Okay, so this may be conceptualised, not altogether accurately, as the flip side of fidelity. I would argue that it's considered separately because an adaptation doesn't necessarily mean implementation failure or fidelity failure. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail later on. So we know from the literature that interventions are rarely implemented as designed. We can go further for school-based interventions and we can say that adaptations are inevitable. That is, an intervention can be given to a school, it will not be implemented exactly as designed, it will be adapted in some way for delivery. And we already know that this implementation variability, due to adaptations, due to lack of fidelity, is linked to the achievement of intended outcomes. Okay, so adaptations create implementation variability, but they don't necessarily mean implementation failure. There are multiple types of adaptations. They could be superficial or structural. They may be intentional if a teacher is trying to improve the fit of an intervention with her context or pupils. I said her there. I know not all teachers are hers, but it could be her or him. They could be accidental, and accidental adaptation is really, really very, very interesting because it starts to suggest that an implementer doesn't have a complete understanding of the intervention they're delivering, which can create all sorts of problems for delivery. Adaptations can be reactive or proactive, so reactive in response to a barrier, or proactive, again, to improve fit. It could be changing times, collapsing lessons in a structured intervention, just to make it fit into a curriculum time. They may occur for a variety of reasons, but it's often due to factors affecting implementation. So, structural changes, which may mean leaving out critical parts of an intervention. So in a structured one, perhaps changing order of lesson delivery, in a sequenced curriculum, missing out key parts of lessons can be detrimental because then you are omitting the triggers of change. There are certain mechanisms of change. If you miss parts of an intervention out, then you may be omitting those and change will not occur. However, the literature is in general consensus that minor alterations to resources, such as if you change names, photos or vocabulary to reflect cultural context, then that can actually be beneficial for implementation. Right, so that was dimensions of implementation. So these are key aspects that we need to consider if we're evaluating implementation, supporting implementation. We need to think about these dimensions. But then, just to make it a little bit more complicated, we have factors affecting implementation, which are barriers and facilitators. So these will affect every single dimension of implementation. So the model I'm going to use here is looking at 4 levels. I use levels for ease of presentation really. It doesn't imply a hierarchy. You could have more levels, so you could be looking at community characteristics, cultural characteristics, national policy, for example. We're just focusing here on 4 different levels, which are characteristics of the intervention, characteristics of the implementer, characteristics of the classroom, and characteristics of the school. In each of these levels, you will find factors that will affect implementation. Important to remember 2 things here. So I'm presenting these factors within different levels because it facilitates understanding. Factors may operate both across as well as within levels. It's also important to note that factors may operate as barriers or facilitators, or even both, in one context at one particular time. In the literature, you may find them described as barriers to implementation. I think it's possibly easier to think of them as factors because that way it makes it easier to support implementation processes. So, if you're looking at the intervention level, if you think about the resources, the availability of resources, how accessible and easy to use they are, the quality of the resources are intuitively, and research shows us that it's true, is going to impact on how something is implemented. If a teacher can get hold of the resources, that is going to support implementation. If they can't, or if they're not compatible with the pupils in the class, then it's less likely to be implemented well. So that takes us on compatibility, goodness of fit with pupils' needs, adaptability, well, that's one of the dimensions rearing its head there, and complexity. So just look at this here, because we're going to come back to this. Complexity. The research literature is showing us consistently that the more complex an intervention, the more difficult it is to implement, the less likely it is to be implemented effectively. So a multi-component intervention may include a whole school approach, as well as classroom approaches, as well as parent elements as well. So there's multiple different components involving multiple different members of staff, lots of people to coordinate, lots of people to get on board, and this can make an intervention particularly difficult to deliver. At implementer level, we can separate this into professional characteristics and psychological characteristics. So professional characteristics of a teacher will affect how they respond to and deliver an intervention. Their experience, their level of training, the skills that they have will affect the delivery. So it could be that the more experienced they are, it might help with the implementation, but it also might hinder it, because they might think, well, actually, I've got a much better way of doing things. Why do I need to change? You know, they're always giving us different initiatives. Why do I need to change? So this is how it can operate as a facilitator or a barrier. Psychological characteristics that will affect implementation are stress and burnout and feelings of self-efficacy. And I think this is particularly important. If you look at the stresses that affect teachers, if you give them a new intervention to implement, you have to question whether you are adding to these levels of stress. If you are, what difference is that going to make to how they adopt and implement any new intervention or approach? Another really important factor at implementer level is perceptions of and attitudes to an intervention. If a teacher perceives a benefit to an intervention, they think, yes, this is really, really good, they may be more inclined to implement it. However, if they don't also perceive a need for it within their particular context, then they may be more likely to reject it. Okay, so it's not just the perception of benefit, it's the perception of need. And we have actually seen that in some work we've done before, that teachers say, oh, wonderful intervention, absolutely amazing, we need to promote social and emotional skills. But not in my school, that school down the road, go and see them, but we don't need it. All our pupils are very well adjusted, very well behaved. So it makes such a huge difference. Knowledge and understanding of an intervention and its aims makes a huge difference as well. If a teacher doesn't understand an intervention, what it is that they're trying to achieve, then they are less likely to be able to implement it successfully. Buy-in relates to perceptions of benefit and need for an intervention. Then we're moving on to classroom level. So you could have a teacher that thinks this is an amazing intervention, exactly what my pupils need. I've got the skills for it. The resources are all accessible. These are all factors that will support implementation. Then they look at their classroom, they look at the pupils, they look at the level of disruption, and there's no way they're going to be able to implement a new intervention. So the factors are now all starting to interact, and the benefits of one may not be supported, then the difficulties in another area may mean that the intervention isn't implemented. So behaviour in the classroom, the peer relations, teacher-student relations, the pupil needs as well. So think about that, the pupil needs. If an intervention that a teacher is about to deliver isn't suitable for a pupil's needs, then it's less likely to be implemented. There are ways of addressing that much earlier on. Okay, school level, we'll separate it into implementation environment and implementation support system. So the environment, physical characteristics of a school size, pupil population and needs. The general climate within a school is the receptivity to change, shared decision making. Are teachers involved in decisions? Do they all share an understanding of why they're doing an intervention, what the benefits are, what the need for it is, why they're adopting it? The implementation support system refers more to practical support. So head teacher support, and I don't just mean a head teacher saying, yes, that's fine, I think we need to do that here. It's active support from a head teacher. Yes, we need this intervention. Here is your training time. Here is your preparation time. Here is the time within a curriculum to deliver an intervention. So it's active support rather than just verbal support. Continuing support as implementation processes, communication, positive work relationships, all factors that will affect implementation at school level. Okay. So that's all nice and clear, isn't it? Easy peasy chicken pie. Anyway, so what we know about factors now, they may operate as barriers and facilitators, they interact within and across levels, and now the next bit, they may operate differently at different phases or stages of implementation. And it's important to think of implementation as a process. It's not something you do as a one-off, it's a process. And Fielden in 2005, really interesting, that thick, this paper, but it's really interesting. Very usefully separated the implementation process into separate phases for us, starting with exploration and adoption, installation, initial implementation, and full implementation. Exploration and adoption is really exploring the needs, consideration of the benefits of an intervention. Is it compatible with the school ethos? Really, is it compatible with the pupil skills, the pupils that we want to deliver it to? Do the implementers have the skills already? Installation would then be acquiring the resources that you need and establishing support systems, including training. Initial implementation, they define it as then making curriculum changes, time to deliver. I really would have thought you'd need to do that when you're considering installation, but this is what he's saying, so I'm representing that. Establishing shared vision, enabling continuing support for implementers, and full implementation is the scaling up of an intervention within a school, ensuring that it becomes embedded and that implementation over time is sustained. This creates other problems, which I'm not going to go into now, but it is worth thinking about. Okay, so summary. What we know about implementation is that there are multiple dimensions, that factors will affect implementation of all of these different dimensions, and that these factors may differ at different stages or phases of implementation. Okay, everybody happy with that so far? You've got to nod because I'm not going back, I've not got time. Okay, so now that we all understand implementation, do I really need to go into supporting implementation processes? Do you think you could all say, right, that's absolutely grand, I know all about implementation, I'll go and support this teacher in delivering an intervention. Everybody feel confident to do that?
It's a trick question, right?
No, not really. I think we'll all go home early. No, I mean, there's a lot there, a lot of information there, but I don't know about you, but I look at that and I start to feel a little bit overwhelmed and think, yeah, okay, support the implementation of an intervention, but where do I actually start? And fortunately, there are multiple frameworks or models for supporting implementation. These are general frameworks. You rarely find a framework that is designed to support a specific intervention. If you do, it comes with the intervention and it's more often for a prescribed intervention. So example frameworks here, Fielden et al., implementation research, going down to one in 2017, implementing effective educational practices. This is good. It's a complex area. There are these frameworks. But, and this is the bit that is, it's a bit of a conundrum really, you have these frameworks because there is a lot known about implementation now, because people want to support effective implementation, these models are becoming increasingly complex and involving multiple components. And what do we know about multiple components? It's a factor affecting implementation. It can mean that implementation is less effective. So we have a framework to support implementation, yet the very fact that we have it and it's complex means that it's less likely to be implemented carefully and with fidelity. So it is a bit of a conundrum. We have this framework, but because it's so complex, can we actually use it? Which is a little bit worrying, really. So what we're going to do, what I'm going to do here now, is I'm going to take one of these frameworks. I'm taking the Quality Implementation Framework, Meyers, Durlach and Wandersman. The reason I've selected this one is because it presents quite a nice blueprint, and also because it synthesised findings from 25 different frameworks, looked at what was said most commonly and aimed to simplify them to a certain extent. So we're going to take this framework and then we're going to consider how what we know about implementation can be used to support interpretation of this framework so that it can work for us or for anybody that wants to support a school, a teacher, any organisation in delivering an intervention. It's very usefully arranged in phases. We've got phase 1 there, phase 2, 3 and 4. What is quite nice about this is mapped directly onto Fielden. So you've got exploration and adoption, installation, initial implementation and full implementation. So immediately this makes it a little bit easier. You know that you've got these different stages to look at, and you know that you can take each of these phases and start to split them up. If you start to chunk things, it makes it much easier to process and to do something with. And then if you look, we've got another column here, various things we need to do, assessment strategies, decisions about adaptation, capacity building strategies, and steps. For each of these, it's breaking it down a little bit more. You could take that framework, you could say, right, we're on our exploration stage, we've got to do assessment strategies, we've got to conduct a needs and resources assessment. Okay, I'll do that, but why? Why am I doing it? If you understand why you are doing something, it makes it much easier to adapt a framework so that it is working for you. So, if we start to apply the different factors affecting implementation, you're doing this first one, you're conducting a needs and resources assessment, you're conducting a fit assessment, because you're starting to address possible barriers to implementation at intervention level and classroom level. Does that make sense? So you're using knowledge of implementation to interpret a framework to make it work for you so that you understand exactly what each of these points are and why they matter. So then, for example, conducting a capacity readiness assessment is starting to address possible barriers to implementation at implementer or school level. So capacity, do we have the capacity within school? Have we got somebody to lead it? If it requires withdrawing pupils or a pupil from a classroom, have we got somewhere for them to go? So it's school level organisation factors and implementer skills there. Intervention, can we adapt this intervention if it's not suitable for our particular pupils? Implementer school level factors are beginning to be addressed in these next areas. So obtaining buy-in from your implementers will address some implementer characteristics, perception of need as well as perception of benefits. You're looking at staff training, which will address implementer difficulties such as self-efficacy. School factors that we're addressing there, creating implementation teams, developing an implementation plan, implementer level. Then we go into process evaluation, which is evaluation, but it should be part, according to most of the research, of any implementation support model, because teachers, schools need to be able to reflect on what they're doing, what's going right, what's going wrong, are we achieving what we need to achieve, do we need to modify it, how can we change things. It's learning from experience, which is here. So this is how we could take a model and start to apply the factors affecting implementation to our understanding, interpretation of a framework so that we can make it work for us. Then we're taking the dimensions of implementation, and again these can be applied to a framework. Conducting a needs and resources assessment is about programme differentiation, and that will relate again back to factors. Fit assessment is programme reach, fidelity and quality here, adaptation, fidelity and adaptations, fidelity again, and quality, fidelity. Quality and adaptations, staff recruitment, have we got the staff training? They have to be taught how to deliver it with quality, how to deliver it with fidelity. Fidelity again, creating implementation teams, developing an implementation plan. All these different dimensions are relevant to all these different areas, all relevant to the last bit. Anybody notice anything? What dimension kept cropping up there? Did I not give you a hint? Did I not keep saying fidelity? Yes, fidelity, fidelity again, fidelity again. And this is really interesting because the implementation literature has focused on fidelity. Again, it's probably the macro view, but it might also be the micro view. There's always this emphasis on fidelity of implementation. And this takes us very nicely to a debate which has been raging within implementation science ever since it first began to emerge. And this is the nicely named fidelity adaptation debate. So proponents of full fidelity would say you must implement any intervention approach with 100% fidelity, because the outcomes that you have demonstrated can be achieved when you've been testing it can only be achieved in the real world if you replicate it absolutely perfectly, exactly as it was originally designed. If you don't do this, the critical components processes may be omitted and change might not be triggered. So if you cut short lessons, miss out different components, change key objectives, replace activities, you might not trigger these mechanisms of change and you will not achieve the outcomes that you want. A proponent would also say that if you don't have fidelity, implementation variability, we know this has a negative impact on outcomes. Fidelity is of utmost concern for program developers, and that makes intuitive sense. A program developer will say, well, my intervention is, I have shown it works, but if a school doesn't implement it properly exactly as I tell them and they don't achieve the results, they're going to say, it doesn't work, and they're not going to bother with it anymore. So fidelity is a primary concern for many program developers. But we know interventions are not implemented as designed, not implemented as designed at all in schools. So instead of saying you have to implement with 100% fidelity, maybe we should start to acknowledge this and think about why they are adapted. And there's a recent paper that's just under review at the moment that I've been writing with an Australian colleague, and I don't know where there's Liz. Liz might know a bit more about this than I do. But one of the things we've thought about and we've looked at with one of the programs we evaluated was the adaptations that teachers made. And we've been able to trace those back and think, well, actually, teachers are trained to adapt their approaches to pupils. Their aim is to promote good progress and to adapt to respond to the strengths and needs of all pupils. So if teachers are trained to adapt, to be adaptable, to use their knowledge, to use their experience, to deliver good teaching, to achieve outcomes, is it then wrong of us to be, or program developers, to be demanding fidelity? Ought they be able to trust teachers, allow teachers to use this professional knowledge and experience to adapt interventions? So this is an area that we are starting to explore. I think it's quite an interesting area. My immediate response, before I've looked at it in more detail, would be, yes, we have to allow teachers to adapt, but even though adaptations are not automatically implementation failure, they're not always beneficial. So beneficial adaptations, I mentioned them before, could be surface level changes to improve goodness of fit. These will facilitate implementation, promote ownership if a teacher is able to adapt it to their own context, support effectiveness, increase sustainability. Research has shown that. Great, let's all adapt. Adapt as much as we want. But everybody will have that little niggle. Okay, if you keep adapting, what happens to the original programme? Where's that gone? Is it still there anymore? Is it going to achieve the outcomes? So we have detrimental adaptations as well, which could be structural changes, changing objectives, adding inappropriate activities or supplementary resources. So if a teacher has delivered an intervention or a similar intervention previously and they thought, well, that was a really good activity, really enjoyed that, I'm going to take this one out of the new intervention, I'm going to do this instead, what sort of impact might that have on outcomes? So yes, we can say adaptations can be beneficial. We know they're inevitable, they can be beneficial, but they can also be detrimental, which suggests that really if we're supporting implementation processes, we need to be considering the aims of the programme, how the programme works, how the mechanisms of change work, what can be positive adaptations, what can help sustainability, delivery, goodness of fit with context. Excellent. However, as more research has been done into adaptations, again, this is a more emerging part of an emergent science, but even positive adaptations can be detrimental if there are too many of them. So good, beneficial adaptation can still have a negative impact, and this does make sense. And you could have multiple positive adaptations, introduce these, and then the original programme again has disappeared, so you're not going to achieve the outcomes. Okay, so the fidelity adaptation debate, it is really getting to the stage where it's believed that fidelity and adaptation can begin to co-occur. So positive results from interventions have been found with levels of around 60% fidelity, which suggests that you can have some form of adaptation, that they're not exclusive, they may co-occur. But that has to be really treated with some caution. 60% fidelity, but it has to be a certain 60%. It has to be these key components. It has to be these essential or critical elements of an intervention. So interventions need to start specifying which 60% must be implemented with fidelity and those that may be adapted. And we know from the literature that the number and quality of adaptations is important. But then there's also an argument that it is the quality of fidelity that also needs to be considered. So looking at this fidelity adaptation debate, two dimensions of implementation, we're now starting to bring in these other dimensions as well, and we're starting to see how they interact. And again, I think this supports taking the micro view of implementation, that we need to look at each dimension separately. Just to briefly illustrate that point, I've observed lessons, Alex has done as well, and we've gone in, the teacher's been delivering an intervention and they've got the text there, everything they've got to read, and they're sitting there and going, right children, today we are looking at what we need to do to be good friends with people. 100% fidelity. Yes, this program's going to work, but are the pupils going to be engaged? Might it be more beneficial if the teacher says, I know what I'm supposed to be doing, I'm going to deliver this with quality. Okay, children, now today, let's talk about falling out in the playground. How can we develop and maintain relationships? So this is where quality starts to interact with fidelity, and recent work that we've done has started to demonstrate it is quality of implementation that is particularly important. It matters just as much as fidelity in this micro view of implementation. Okay, summary and key points for supporting implementation processes. Loads of frameworks out there readily available. Have a look at them. Think about how they might apply to your specific intervention. Then apply your knowledge of implementation processes to them. What is actually meant by this step? What factors are we addressing here? What dimensions of implementation? Remember the tension between a demand for fidelity and a teacher's training their need to adapt. And then think about what is the logic model. How does this program actually work? And quality moderates both fidelity and adaptations. Okay, right, so now could you all go out and support? Maybe not, hopefully. Right, tomorrow, new job for you. You're going to that school down the road and they've got a new intervention and you're going to make it work. Don't look so blankly. Okay, we'll have questions at the end. We're now going to move on to the third goal of implementation science, which is evaluating implementation. So, lovely quote from Durlac: the degree to which an intervention is well executed is just as important as any part of a programme evaluation. When we're talking about evaluation, there could be multiple different types. As we saw in the frameworks for supporting implementation, it could be a local, a school level process evaluation just to assess progress, feasibility, impact of an intervention, whether it's actually worth continuing with it. You would then have a formative evaluation which would support design and feasibility, and summative evaluations which will say, did this programme work? Why did it work as well? Okay, so a formal implementation and process evaluation, IPE, may be conducted as part of a larger trial. And all the evaluations we do of these school-based interventions will include and implementation and process evaluation. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So an IPE may be formative or summative. We need it because we need to understand the effects of variability. We want to be able to explain how change occurs, not just whether it did or didn't. We want to clarify why it did or didn't work and why it might have worked differently with different participants. We want to know about the factors that hinder or contribute to effective implementation. This is all to support the scaling up of an intervention. If we evaluate one, it's generally in more maybe of maybe beyond a pilot stage, but we're looking at does it work in multiple contexts. The aim is generally to then be able to scale up an intervention to launch it more broadly so that many more schools can take advantage of an intervention. So essentially we're trying to find out how it can work in different contexts for different people. So if you're developing an intervention, you would need to look at implementation at each of these different stages. So for pilot, efficacy stage, it's formative. You're initially looking at, is the programme as it's designed feasible? Can teachers actually implement it? If you've designed an intervention and it requires teachers to take an hour and a half out of every day to deliver an intervention, you then pilot it and you find, oh, Actually, they only have 45-minute lessons. Oh, teachers for some reason aren't prepared to take an hour and a half out of every day. So you would be tweaking an intervention as you're piloting it. You look at moderating factors. It should, and it doesn't always do this is quite important, you should be identifying critical and non-critical components. These are really important because they can support fidelity and adaptation. If you identify critical components, you can say, must be implemented like this, but this is the flexible area, you can adapt this because they are non-critical components. You would assess implementation at pilot stage to examine and test logic models and theories of change, and you establish internal and construct validity, i.e. this program does work. But then it works in this particular context. So you'd move on to an effectiveness stage, which is in a real-world context. You'd evaluate the implementation there, and it would be very much a naturalistic context, using the staff resources that are available. Does this program work in naturalistic settings? Why? Why not? What works for what sort of populations? Very much a realist evaluation. Again, look at moderating factors, check feasibility, ready to inform scaling up, and you're demonstrating external validity. Doesn't just work in this context, it works in multiple other contexts as well. Scale up, full dissemination. There are very rarely implementation and process evaluations conducted when a program has been scaled up in many schools right across the country. And the reason for that, anybody think of a reason for that? That is part of it, this assuming fidelity, but it's also if I were to come to you as funders and say, right, well, it's scaled up, I want to see how all these many different schools are getting on with this intervention, you are more likely to turn around and say, well, actually, we're more interested in looking at new interventions and how they're actually working and whether they need to work. We've already tested that they work, so it doesn't really matter about sustainability over time. Okay, so formative assessment at pilot and efficacy stages, effectiveness and scale trials. There may be formative and summative evaluations. Formative because you're wanting to inform future implementation, and summative evaluations because you're looking at, did it work, why not? So, a summative evaluation, so to put this into context, in our evaluations, the implementation and process evaluation strand is typically conducted as part of a randomised controlled trial, an RCT or a cluster randomised controlled trial. And the data on implementation will supplement any outcome data, any impact data. And we need this because if you don't look at implementation, there is a huge risk of a type 3 error. Now, most people will have heard of a type 1 and type 2 error. A type 3 error refers to an inaccurate attribution of cause. So if you are just conducting an impact trial, and you find that actually, there's no difference between our comparison school and our treatment school, so the intervention doesn't work. If you have not looked at whether it is implemented with sufficient fidelity, you may be saying a program doesn't fail, where it doesn't work, where in fact it may be due to implementation failure. This has major implications at school level, both financial costs and also staff well-being as well. If you've not assessed whether a program doesn't work because it's due to implementation failures, you are then likely to say, well, that one doesn't work, we'll go and take on another one. And time again, teachers will complain about initiative overload. It's a great source of stress, it's a great source of burnout. Just get used to one intervention and you're asked to do another one, but don't think that one worked. You need to explore why it doesn't work, and then start thinking about how it might be tweaked. Because if a program gets to an RCT, there must be some evidence beforehand that it can work in some contexts. Okay, multiple dimensions of fidelity, as we've said. You would be exploring each of these in an evaluation. Is it implemented as intended? How frequently? How well? Are the recipients engaged? Are target recipients receiving intervention? What is usual practice? What adaptations are made? I don't think I need to go through those again, but you would need to be looking at all of these different dimensions. If you were to just focus on one, such as fidelity, and you look at fidelity and there's no impact, you then might assume that it's because it was low fidelity, there was no impact. but it isn't automatically causal. It could be other factors. It could be quality that is coming into play there as well. I also mentioned earlier that there was an additional dimension which you should look at in evaluations, and that's monitoring comparison conditions, which is assessing the extent to which the critical components are already implemented in the comparison school. Now this is really, really important. As an example, again, just to put it in some context, for some of the evaluations we've done, we've recruited schools based on their interest in a particular evaluation. So they all volunteer to participate because they want this intervention in their school. They perceive a need for it. They are then randomised. If they're randomised to the comparison condition, their perceived need, isn't actually addressed. So what may happen in that school? They've still got to address this need. It might be something that's been picked up at an inspection. So they are going to adopt something else, or they're very likely to implement something similar so they can address this need that they have. You are then unlikely, or it may be that you don't find any difference between your treatment schools and your comparison schools, because they're both implementing more or less the same thing, although it may be under a completely different name. No such thing as a comparison condition in the real world anyway, because with schools, because you can't control what is going on in schools. Type 3 error if a comparison school is implementing the key components. Okay, so if you're evaluating, you need to be looking at dimensions, factors, and ideally you would be collecting information at multiple phases and stages of implementation. These are the factors implementation that you would measure. You may go in with measures which include a priori items based on these factors that we know about. I would also always advise that you should be looking for unanticipated factors. Interventions all vary. There may be more specific intervention-specific factors or emergent factors that would need to be identified, particularly for future scaling up. So, couple of minutes now, I'm just going to give you an example of how we used all those aspects, the factors affecting implementation, the dimensions of implementation, to examine implementation in the Paths to Success project. Bit of context: Paths, school-based universal program, which means it's for all pupils regardless of need. Aim is to promote emotional and social competencies. It's systematic, developmentally sequenced, designed to be taught by teachers in classroom settings 2 to 3 times a week. So it means that if you miss out any lessons, then what comes next is unlikely to have any foundations. There's going to be some learning that's missing. Highly prescribed, very manualised, explicit materials and instructions. So we took a pragmatic approach, so we wanted a realistic understanding. We used a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods, and we used teachers, head teachers, paths coordinates, pupils and parents as our participants. We examined all the different dimensions of fidelity as well as factors affecting implementation. And this, if you can see it, is how we actually did it. What I haven't included in here, which I should have done, it might have made it a bit complex, was how we looked at these at different phases of implementation. So, for example, we used the usual practice survey for looking at programme differentiation and comparison conditions. So asking schools about what did you do before you took on the intervention? What do you do? What are the practices that you do? So that we can start to see, actually, if we have no impact, is it because our comparison school is already implementing the intervention? We looked at teacher implementation fidelity through, we had a survey, and we had a factors affecting implementation survey, a survey looking at implementers' characteristics relating to burnout, stress. We also looked at attitudes towards social emotional learning. We then conducted interviews, qualitative interviews, semi-structured interviews, which picked up on all these different dimensions of implementation as well as factors affecting implementation. This meant that we were able to combine our qualitative and quantitative data and use it to develop a much deeper understanding. We also conducted observations. Our observation schedule was a mix of rating. It included rating scales for whether something had been implemented with fidelity, or with quality, but we also took more qualitative, we examined adaptations and looked at how they'd actually been done. So this is an example of how you might then be able to apply all these different dimensions, factors affecting implementation into your evaluation of a school-based intervention. And this is just roughly those. So we're on our summary. You can breathe again now. We're at the very end. So just to summarise, implementation is a set of activities that compose the process of putting a practice or programme into place in an organisation. So we're all happy with that. Implementation, we know from the literature, is variable across contexts. This impacts on outcomes of an intervention, so we need to explore it. There are 3 interrelated goals of implementation science: understanding and supporting and evaluating implementation processes. As we do more work towards one of these goals, it then feeds back into the other goals. 2, and improving implementation and our understanding of it has major implications, including reducing financial burdens on school, initiative overload and staff well-being. Okay, one of my favourite quotes from 1976, which is quite sad really, because things haven't changed an awful lot in all the decades since then. So the bridge between a promising idea and its impact on students is implementation, but innovations are seldom implemented as planned, which is really, really quite sad. Okay, any questions? Caroline?
I was quite interested in, you were talking about whether fidelity should be kind of a superordinate concept.
Yes.
And I've heard you talk as well about social validity in the past.
Yes.
That should be a superordinate concept. So I'm just wondering how you see those.
So I see fidelity as a dimension, and I think it should be, you should take the micro view, it is a separate dimension. Social validity I see as relating more to a factor affecting implementation, and it pulls in factors to do with an intervention, to do with an implementer. Social validity, for anybody that doesn't know, it dates back to Wolf 1978, and it has 3 key areas. The first area is are the outcomes of an intervention wanted by the people that are expected to implement it? So is there that perception of need for it? The second area relates to the processes of implementation. So a teacher might like an intervention, but if they don't like the way it's delivered, they don't like the processes that they have to use to deliver it, they may be more likely to say, no, don't want to do this one. The third area is almost like a cost-benefits ratio. Was the effort invested, including time, financial, anything you can think of, was all the effort invested worth the outcomes that were actually generated? And this relates directly to sustainability of an intervention. So I would look at social validity there as relating to the factors affecting implementation. Does that make sense? If you can see it as another dimension, I'd be really interested to talk about that and to see how you're conceptualising it, because that could be very helpful. Okay? No, you can't ask questions.
No, I was going to. I would like to welcome the opportunity to ask more questions, but I'm just very conscious of time and people need to escape to other things. So, because I was before too long, can I take the opportunity to thank you for your time and thank you for your contributions.
Nobody's asleep.
This then provides that socially valid excuse to leave, and then those who you could talk about all day, and then so we could do.
Yes, I have done that before, haven't I? I have, yes. Must admit. Okay. Ruth.
So, I'd like to ask a provocative question about implications of this. I mean, I thought that was fantastic. I've never seen such a thorough analysis of why things happen like they do in schools.
Thank you.
So, but if I was the EEF or the government spending money on the value, I would now say, given that there's all the dimensions, the factors not only interact with each other, but some are barriers and some are facilities. You've got incredibly complex things there going on. And not to mention, context on top of that, really. You would have to go on, surely, evaluating these interventions over and over and over and over and over again, taking into account all these implementations findings before you could be really sure that you really knew about the effectiveness of the intervention. So, billions of pounds and many, many years later, you would know something. That's what seems to be. And, I just wonder really, that's why, you know, is that what they read from it? You know, that actually they should be putting more money into understanding how things happen in schools and how these factors really work.
Okay, so we're going back to real world research now. Yeah, we know that we haven't got that sort of money, so it's taking this pragmatic approach. What is happening at this particular time? So the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, what they are actually asking for now in their evaluations is a full implementation and process evaluation based on guidance that we have written, led by Neil, and various people here have worked on it as well. And it's not taking a light touch, it's looking at these dimensions, it's looking at the factors that are affecting implementation, and it's saying this is what is happening in this particular context. These have implications for anybody wishing to adopt an intervention in future. So you can't go on ad infinitum. I mean, you can't with any sort of research. Any research you can do, you can say, well, this is what happened in this context. What about this context, this context, this context? It's just not feasible, it's not viable.
So we're shifting the budget a bit more towards perhaps fewer interventions tested, but more money spent on really bottoming out there.
Well, what they're saying now is that any evaluation has to look at the impact, has to look at narrowing the gap for disadvantaged children, but it must also conduct an IP, an implementation and process evaluation. The reason for that is that the early reports were coming out and saying this intervention didn't work. And fine, you know, we can say this intervention didn't work. Previous research has shown it does work. So why did it not work now? If they can't answer those questions, it's not really helping anybody. So the implementation and process evaluation is essentially to explain why it worked, why it didn't work, what could be done to support effective implementation when an intervention is scaled up. So that's essentially the information that they want. Does that answer it?
Yeah, well, I think that's a really positive development, and hopefully we'll see that coming through on their, you know, in their public, because we get very kind of top level, this one works and after 3 months, and it, you know, whereas all of this is kind of what the story we kind of really need to know, I think.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Yeah. I think linked to that as well, we really need to know why an intervention didn't work, particularly when it has a sound logic model, a really strong underpinning program theory. So why did it not work? And I think the problem is if you say, well, it didn't work, let's abandon that, let's go on to something else, it's costing so much money, and like I said, it has its implications for staff well-being as well. So understanding why it didn't work, what might actually be tweaked or modified to improve effectiveness in a future or in a future context, I think is really, really important. Anybody else? Terry?
I had a reflection. I suppose thinking of training therapists, we often talk about sort of, are we training them in a science or an art?
Yes.
And I guess it sort of follows on in some ways, sort of thinking about the kind of consideration of, well, what's actually happening in this process? Is it actually about sort of trying to pin down, and eventually there will be kind of some sort of bottoming out that we find the truth? Or is it about more sensitizing people to kind of what might be viewed as, rather than implementation science, but sensitizing people to a more sophisticated intervention art form?
Yeah. I think it can be viewed both ways depending on what your perspective is, what your epistemological beliefs are. But I would have thought that sensitizing people to how to deliver something so that it has optimal results, I suppose that is like an art form, really. If you think about how you're delivering it, the quality of it, if you're thinking about any adaptations you are making to a model, why you are making those, are they changing how this model would suggest something works? I think really if you're starting to inspire people to ask these questions, it may be applicable then, it may be an art form, it may be a combination of both. I don't know.
Because I'm kind of lean on the science angle, but because you mentioned critical components being the transferable or common element between contexts?
Yes. Yeah, so I mean that would also apply, I would have thought, because again, if you've got an approach, if you're, I don't know enough about different therapies, but if you've got a particular approach and you say, well, one of the key things is that your clients are able to have an opportunity to do this or to do this, that becomes a critical component. That is an essential part of it, and you must include that, and you must do it with Fidelity. However, you can adapt it to your own practice the way you would respond, or does that make sense within your context?
No, it's interesting, and I suppose it's sort of that straddling or juggling the inevitable that it's part art, part science.
Yes.
I think it's interesting that we sometimes weight things towards the science, because that's where I think the rhetoric, the kind of the strong arguments are kind of positioned at present.
Yeah. So science, I mean, essentially, what works, why does it work, is a scientific part of it, but then it's using that knowledge and applying it more broadly, I suppose. Yeah? Yeah? We can have a chat about that. Okay, anybody else? Sarah.
I was wondering what you think about teacher and school level factors when I think of how accountability,
Yes.
accountability and assessment or evaluation work, both across England, Scotland, all different components of the United Kingdom. They're all quite similar, but at the same time what that means for teachers and things like well-being and the workforce in the short and long term agenda, that's a big factor, I think, when you're talking about buy into these things.
Yeah, and I think that then relates to implemented characteristics. So what we find is that buy-in is a huge factor. A teacher has to buy into an intervention, believe it's needed, have the skills to deliver it, have the time to deliver it. But then if an intervention is a non-academic intervention, it's not something that links to their accountability, it's not something that their performance is assessed on, then it's likely to slip down the list of priorities and be abandoned. So again, I think that could be another factor that goes in there, how accountable teachers are, how it actually matters in the grand scheme of things, the extent to which it is important for. Does that answer that one?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah? Okay. Any more? Any questions? No?
Thank you very much.
Grand stuff, right, we can all go home. Thank you very much.